All right, hi everyone. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gumpert from MS Dynamics World. Always pleased and excited to be able to host these events. This month, we are back with Nicholas Hayduk to lead things for us. And this month's focus topic, as you will hear more about, is Power Pages authentication. Just a couple notes as we start. First, we do welcome your questions. Look for the questions block and enter them anytime. Nick will be keeping an eye on those. And we're also recording today's event, so we'll be sharing information on that after the session ends. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way here and hand things over to Nick.
All right, thank you, Jason. Welcome. As Jason mentioned, today we're talking about Power Pages authentication, a fun topic that comes up on, almost every Power Pages implementation. So as you'll see, this isn't the first time we've talked about this, but I thought it might be time for a refresher. So let's get into it. Quick introduction. If this isn't the first time if this is the first time you've joined us, my name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm the president and a software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan. We're a Microsoft partner that assists people, clients, partners all over the world with Power Pages implementation. We also have EC Learn, which is our learning management system for the Power Platform. I personally have been working with the Power Pages product pretty much since the beginning of the product itself. My career began at ADX Studio, which was the company that originally built ADX Studio Portals, which turned into Power Pages eventually. So for the last 15 years or so, this is where the focus of my career has been. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, please feel free to do so. You can also follow us on Twitter or X. We've got our blog that I put out about once a month. We've got our YouTube channel, which contains not only these recordings, but our weekly tips. Those come out on Tuesdays, as well as you can check out the Refresh the Cache podcast at crm.audio. We just dropped a new episode over the weekend. And there's another one coming up here pretty quickly too. So if you're interested in all things Power Pages, give us a follow on those social platforms, and we'll be sure to keep you in the loop as to all the various content that we put out that's focused on Power Pages. As always, I want to say thanks to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for their support of these community calls through the 5 or so years that these been going on. Great partner, and appreciate everything you do for the community in general. I love going through your emails on a regular basis and see all the news, whether it's kind of Power Pages, or I get to see some stuff across all the different parts of the Microsoft business applications. So thanks to him and his team for all they've done over the years as well. Our agenda is as typical. We've got a little bit of news, not much news this month, honestly. Then we'll get into today's topic. We'll talk about the date and time of the next community call, which actually I'm pretty excited about. We got 2 guest presenters coming on next month, so that should be fun. And then we will have some time for Q&A as well. But as Jason mentioned, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please drop those in the questions block there, and I will do my best to pay attention to those and deal with them as they come up. So what do we got for news this month? Like I said, relatively light month, so not a ton, but I would say one really exciting thing, and that is environment variables with site settings. So this is something that I think a lot of people have been asking for a long time, and that is, if you're familiar with the site settings capabilities within Power Pages, site settings is a table in Dataverse. It's a pretty simple table. It's got a name, it's got a value, and it's the way that various settings within Power Pages are controlled. Authentication is a big one. Lots of security settings are stored in site settings. But for years and years, basically since the beginning of the product 15 years ago, it was always just, hey, it's a table in Dataverse. You've got your value that's stored in that table in Dataverse. And so if you wanted to have different values for site settings, which was typical for maybe different authentication provider settings in dev, test, production, if you had different kind of API keys or API URLs, depending on which type of environment you're in. So those kind of ALM type settings that you wanted to have different across different environments, you kind of had to manage that. You had to kind of figure out how you're going to do that, because site settings themselves were just, setting. If you move them across environments, you would overwrite, in any sort of upstream environment. Now, if you're using the enhanced data model, you can, instead of saying, hey, store the value of my site setting in the site setting table, you can say, instead refer to this environment variable. And then once you do that, the value for that site setting is just pulled from whatever the value of that environment variable happens to be. And what's great about that is that environment variables are the out of the box, purpose built way of doing ALM settings in Dataverse and kind of Power Platform. So there's all sorts of built-in functionality to kind of pipelines and the whole kind of ALM procedures within Power Platform to support having different environment variables in different environments. So now we can say Power Pages leverages those as well. So it's pretty simple. If you've had a chance to play with it yet, I'm not sure. But just when you go to your site settings, there's a new kind of drop down, as I think that says source, and your options are either an environment variable or the table. And so if you pick environment variable, then there's just a lookup to which environment variable you want it to be. And if you select table, then you just put in the kind of hard code the value right there. So pretty simple enhancement, but I think that's going to make a lot of people's ALM process that much smoother. So really excited to see that. The other thing that has been announced is that the ability to restrict auth providers is now GA. So within the Power Platform Admin Center, you can control, which, whether auth providers are enabled kind of throughout the for all sites or certain sites or not for certain sites, that sort of thing. It's been there. I don't know. I can't remember exactly when that came out in preview, but it's now generally available. So everyone out there can start taking advantage of that if you have some organizational policies that you want to enforce in terms of auth providers, which, of course, with today's topic, we're going to be talking about auth providers. So, and again, that's really all we had for news. That's all that I saw on the blog, on the Power Pages blog recently. So let's move on to today's topic. So again, today's topic is Power Pages authentication. This is, obviously it's an important topic. I say it's often overlooked. I think it's often underestimated as to what the complexity of authentication might be within a Power Pages implementation. And as I mentioned, this isn't the first time we're covering it. In fact, it was such an important topic that I felt it was a good topic for our second ever community call back in February of 2020. I just figured, it was time for an update to this session. So I would say a lot of what, if you look back to the session in February 2020, not a lot of that session is necessarily wrong. There's a few things that have been updated, but most of that content, is applicable. So I'm not. The goal of this is not to kind of redo that one, but again, I just felt it was time for an update in terms of authentication, because this is something we get asked about a lot. We're asked to consult on various projects, and often authentication is an area where people are asking for our help, because it may not be an area that they work a lot in. So so let's get into it. So why is it that authentication is kind of a tricky subject? You'd think maybe it's just usernames and passwords. How hard can it be? But I would say there's a few reasons why you want to just kind of be aware of authentication and make sure not to kind of overlook it or underestimate it. And the first one is that often there's a lot of projects won't have an authentication subject matter expert on the team. There won't be that expert that just kind of knows authentication like the back of their hand. Especially when we're talking about projects within the Power Platform. For pretty much every project or every other type of product other than Power Pages, authentication isn't a huge thing, right? For the most part, you're using Entra ID. It's probably already set up. It's not that not that big of a thing. Whereas with Power Pages, hopefully you're not using the local auth, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But hopefully you're not using that. So there is some sort of setup. There is something often kind of net new to the organization. It's maybe not a tool that they already have set up. So And there's just no one on the team. Like if you have kind of a traditional Power Platform team, there just may be no one on that team that is overly familiar with all how authentication works, how to set it up, what are the options. So often it's just an area that's on the teams that may be tackling one of these projects, just not something that they're already familiar with. Another thing is that often organizations have policies around authentication that you need to consider, you need to follow, even if those policies were maybe not intended for a project like this. So we often see it where it's like, hey, our policy is that multi-factor authentication needs to be enabled. Hey, great policy. Totally understand why people like MFA. But maybe some of those authentication policies were more for internal services, services where you're not having to support, thousands of external clients, thousands of people that you just don't have, the ability to kind of give them training on all these things. So often organizations will say, hey, we talked to IT. If we're going to do authentication, here's the giant book of all the policies we have to follow. But those policies were often developed for the purpose of securing internal systems where you do have that control over the how the employees are going to work, and they may not just may not be kind of meant for those other types of things. So often in the time span that you have for your Power Pages projects, you may not have the time to update those policies in order to to be compliant. So you just have to kind of look and figure out how are we going to implement all these policies and make it fit in that particular situation. Another thing is that I think often the difference between authentication versus registration versus security, it's not clear to a lot of people. It's like, hey, the invitation code process. Yes, that's somewhat tied into authentication, but really that's more of a registration thing. Web roles, the security side of things. That is not really tied so much to authentication. Yeah, you got to authenticate to get in, to get your security, to get your web roles. But there's lots of different ways that you can do authentication, as we're about to see. And so sometimes people will think, hey, I figured out web roles, security. So I've got this all handled. And it's like, well, there's this one specific piece about auth. And if I could add to this list on the fly, it would be the fact that local auth exists and it's kind of there, and people don't realize that maybe they shouldn't be using it. But again, so today we're going to focus kind of on authentication, and we're not going to worry too much about registration and security. And finally, what I got here is that there are lots of choices to be made. And as I'll mention again with local auth, it seems like there's already a choice made for you and you can just use it, but unfortunately kind of the default is not what's recommended. So there's choices to be made. I wouldn't say they're all honestly like the easiest choices. Like there's something that which identity provider you're going to use. We'll see what these choices are, but they're not always the easiest questions to get answered. Not often is the team that's kind of building the Power Pages site the one that is able to answer those questions. So just overall, authentication can be a tricky thing. Authentication is something that we raise at the very outset of our projects. It's not something to say, okay, well, we'll figure that out near the end. It is something from day one, because again, with policies and procedures and how and often to do anything with authentication, you got to bring in a global admin who has all the privileges. It is something that can take some steps. So something that should be considered from the beginning. So we talk about there. I mentioned that there's a lot of choices. So what are those choices? So the first choice is local auth or an external identity provider. So what do I mean by local auth? So Power Pages has basically since the beginning has a built-in username and hash password mechanism where if you're using local auth, the username and the hash password are stored and managed directly in Dataverse and Power Pages. So we're not talking about using any sort of social identities. We're not talking about using any sort of external identity providers. The username and a hash version of the password are stored directly in Dataverse, and so you don't have to worry about any other external system, which sounds good. Sounds like you're not relying on anything else. So it seems like that might be a good choice. It's very easy. It's there out of the box. There's really nothing you have to click on to to enable it. It's just there. Um, Whereas the other alternative is using external identity providers. So in this case, the username and passwords are managed by some external service. There are lots of options, as we'll see. Um, and the way that those are linked to our contact record, because when we're talking about logging in, we're talking about logging in and it being associated to a contact record. The way, instead of the username and password being stored on the contact record directly in Dataverse, there's this other table in Dataverse called external identity, and that external identity contains the information needed to link that username and password from some third-party service to the contact in Dataverse. So here's your first choice. Are we going to use local auth, or are we going to use some sort of external identity provider? And really, hopefully this isn't much of a choice. It is not generally recommended to use local authentication in production. It's totally fine for pre-production environments. It's fine for trials or just kind of testing, demos, that sort of thing. But it was deprecated once. Now this was a few years ago, might even be more than a few years ago. And so Microsoft did retract the deprecation. So currently, as it stands today, it is not deprecated, but we do expect it to happen again. So you are setting yourself up, or we expect that you're setting yourself up for a painful auth migration project in the future. If you've ever been through an authentication migration project, asking people to set up new usernames and passwords is not fun. You're dealing with a lot of, often you have to reach out. You're dealing with a lot of like historical users who may not have, they don't remember their old password. They don't remember their username. Like, it's just that those projects are rarely fun. I'd probably even say they're never fun. Now, the reasons that we don't. Oh, I see a good question here. Okay, about that. Is there a valid reason not to use local auth other than it is not recommended? So primarily, what I would look at is the local authentication has not been touched in years and years and years. So if you are okay with usernames and passwords, or email address and passwords, and for me, the main reasons are we know it, or we very much expect it will be deprecated. So to not use an alternative right now, I think that's kind of my main reason for not having clients go down that road, is that I think I'd be as bold to say as I know that Microsoft would like to deprecate it. We don't know when that's going to happen, but when you know that they want to do something, at some point we do expect that to happen. So that's my main reason, is that I don't want to go to a client and say, hey, we're going to use local auth, and I know that when in 2 or 3 years or next year when we find out it's deprecated, here's a project to do it. Here's going to be a project that's going to be not fun to migrate your users. So that's my number one reason. But also, I like to leverage systems for their intended purposes. Microsoft has given us every signal that Power Pages wants out of the authentication business. They want you to leverage the other services, whether it's Microsoft services or other third-party services. My preference is to leverage services that are meant for those types of things. Those other services have ongoing development. They have new features coming out. The authentication provider within Power Pages, the local auth, isn't getting new features. It isn't getting one-time passwords. It's not getting multi-factor authentication with apps. It's not geo-restricted. So even though it may seem like a simple answer right now to go with local auth, you're really limiting yourself for the future, because I would be very surprised if there were any feature upgrades to that product, part of the product at any point. So yeah, it's easy to set up, but there's no future in it is my main thing. There was some security bulletins that came out recently with some vulnerabilities, and it had to do with like user registration. So I don't know if it was local auth. Honestly, Microsoft's been a little kind of light on the details there. But do I think for someone who has an existing local auth, do I think it's urgent that they move today? I don't, but it's been a few years, and I just don't we just don't do local auth in production for any of our clients because we expect that will be a decision we'll regret in the future. But I wouldn't say that there's any like functional reason it's not like it's bad, other than like again just having usernames and your hashed password and Dataverse. It's just better to have that, in my opinion, in a system that does that on a daily basis, and we can expect updates for. So let's assume you take my advice and you're gonna go with an identity provider. So your second choice is okay. You decided, hey, I'm not going to use local auth. I'm going to use an identity provider. Um, the second choice is, well, which identity provider should we use? And in fact, it's kind of a two-part question. Should we use more than one? So what does Power Pages support? So Power Pages supports. It looks like I think right now we've got 5 specific OAuth 2.0 providers, and those are Microsoft, LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, and X. So those 5 specific um, OAuth 2.0 providers. So it's not any generic OAuth 2.0 providers, it's those specific ones. Power Pages also supports OpenID Connect, SAML 2.0, and WS Federation. So those 3 ones at the bottom are basically kind of open protocols. So I can't say every single one because there are variations within those protocols, but the vast majority, primarily if you find an OpenID Connect compliant provider, if you have a SAML 2.0 compliant provider, if you have one of those, generally you're going to be able to make those work with Power Pages. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for an identity provider that supports OpenID Connect or SAML 2.0 or WS Federation. But primarily, like the big one is OpenID Connect. We still see quite a bit of SAML 2.0, specifically kind of on the kind of some more legacy auth providers, lots in government, that sort of thing, banking, some of the kind of more legacy old school industries. You'll see that SAML 2.0. But yeah, typically you're looking at ID providers that that you're looking for something with OpenID to connect. Okay, sorry, quick questions here. So are you going to cover the conceptual process of moving off local auth in the call? So I don't have it on the agenda today to cover what the process is. Specifically for moving off local auth, they did have some functionality. I'm not sure if it's there anymore since they removed the deprecation, but essentially it's an invitation code model. So with Power Pages, because you can enable multiple identity providers, including local auth, what you can do is one user can themselves have multiple identity providers. So the process, if local auth is still supported and you want to move off, the process at a high level is we'll get your users to kind of get in and migrate, and then you can there are some settings where you can say when someone logs in with an unsupported provider, you can essentially force them to move and select a new authentication provider. So at a high level, you're kind of forcing your users when they log in the next time, or prompting them to kind of log in. You can kind of force them to pick one of the new approved identity providers and move off one of the old ones. So that's the high level conceptual thing, but I don't have it prepared today to kind of demonstrate that specifically. But I will definitely add that to the list of community content, whether I cover that in a call or a tip. But I'll definitely I don't think that's something I've really talked about a whole lot. So yeah, so we've got those different protocols. As I mentioned, with Power Pages, you can have multiple identity providers configured at the same time. So when you go to the sign-in page, what you're presented, what that looks like is you have multiple login links. You can select, I want to log in with Entra ID. Typically, when you set up a default portal, the two authentication options are local sign-in and Entra ID. So that's an example of having 2 kind of different identity providers, one being the local auth and the other one being Entra ID, which is connected through OpenID Connect. The thing to keep in mind is that the identity provider themselves may have multiple logins possible once you click that link. So it can get a little bit confusing. So if we look at kind of traditionally, we have, and we'll get to this, is that so Microsoft traditionally would have recommended using Azure AD B2C. Azure AD B2C was their external login solution for organizations. Um, Recently, Microsoft has come out with I'll call it the next generation. It's not the next version of AD B2C, but it's the next, I say, next generation of external identity solutions, and that's called Entra External ID. So both of these services allow you to configure social identities, multiple social identities for login. So again, you can log into you can log in via a Gmail account, you can log in via a LinkedIn account, you can log in through a Microsoft account. All of those you can configure um, through Azure AD B2C or Entra External ID. However, Power Pages, you only have one identity provider configured. So you configure Entra External ID as your single authentication provider, your single identity provider for Power Pages, and that identity provider in its configuration, you could have multiple ways to log in. So again, Microsoft these days would recommend Entra External ID. Part of the release wave notes was a wizard to help you set that up. Again, previously that would have been Azure AD B2C. They offer similar capabilities, but that's kind of Microsoft's newest version of their newest product to solve that kind of external identity problem. So, what do I recommend? So, if you're an organization or you're building a Power Pages site for an organization that is already using some sort of identity provider for external auth, use it if you can. So, if your organization is already using something like Auth0, Okta, Keycloak, if you've got access, if it's login.gov, if it's government, that sort of stuff, don't introduce don't just go with Entra External ID because it's a Microsoft product. If your organization is already using logins for external people that supports either OpenID Connect or SAML 2.0, use that. That's going to give you kind of single sign-on with any other solutions that might be using it. But I do think this is one of the reasons why this is something important to think about from the beginning. Because if you go to your IT team and say, "Hey, we need to set up Entra External ID," they may we've had this happen. They're like, actually, we're in the middle of investigating all sorts of different external identity solutions right now. So it is a bigger decision. It can be a bigger decision than just what auth are we going to use on Power Pages. It may be a more global organization decision about what is our organization going to use for external identity as an external identity solution. So again, if your organization has already decided on one of those, use it. If not, I mean, Entra External ID offers basic functionality. So if you're just looking for, hey, we just need username and password, we just need email address and password, it's a pretty simple solution. It's pretty simple to set up, and you can do more advanced things. That being said, I would say that the organizations that I know that have kind of really complex requirements, they have they want one-time passwords or geofencing or multi-factor with all sorts of different settings. I have seen people kind of run into kind of reach the cliff of Entra External ID. And I would say that some of the other third-party solutions like Keycloak, Okta, Auth0, those are probably more feature-rich identity providers. So if authentication is something that is like is super super critical to your project, and you want to have all the different abilities, and you want to have all the latest features in auth, and you might want to consider looking at one of those other solutions. But if you're just looking for something relatively basic, Entra External ID is should be fine. That's kind of what we do. I mean, that's our go-to. If authentication hasn't been a big question, like if it wasn't something that's been raised as a huge priority, Entra External ID should certainly do the trick. I always prefer to only configure a single identity provider with Power Pages. So if you want to support having multiple social identity logins, you want to support Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these different authentication providers, great, but do that as part of your third party, or as part of your identity provider, as part of that single identity provider outside of Power Pages. I don't like to mix, trying to use, say, the Microsoft and LinkedIn via OAuth 2 directly in the portal, and then have another identity provider for other things. Like, I just like to have Power Pages has a single identity provider, and then you kind of leave all of the different various kind of social media providers to be something that the one IDP that you pick deals with. So again, avoid the OAuth 2.0 if you want to have those social identity providers. Pick an IDP that does that, and what that allows you to do is it lets you set a provider as default. So when you're setting up your identity providers, that login page that I was talking about earlier, where you have by default you have the sign in with the local auth, and then you have the Entra ID. We want to get rid of that page for the most part altogether. When the user clicks to sign in the top left-hand corner, or sorry, top right-hand corner, we want the user going directly to whatever is the IDP's sign-in page. So if you have a single identity provider that you want to use, and then you set it as default, you're going to skip that kind of /sign-in page. If you go to /sign-in, it's just going to immediately take you to whichever provider you've set as default, and then you go from there. Otherwise, it just leads to extra clicks and a confusing user experience. So again, pick one identity provider. Avoid those OAuth 2, those old kind of OAuth 2.0, and pick one, set it as default, and you're going to get kind of the most seamless experience for authentication. Okay, a couple questions here. So currently have AD B2C for users and AD for Mint. If I move to enter external ID, it handles both in some way. So excellent question. So if we talk about, Azure AD B2C can be used for users, Active Directory for admins. So that would be, Active Directory Entra ID, as it's now called. You can set up Entra ID as one of your providers for Azure in Azure AD B2C. Moving to Entra External ID doesn't change that. It would be the same thing. So if you move to Entra External ID, one of the identity providers you could set up within Entra External ID could be Entra ID. So that applies whether you're using B2C or Entra External ID. The thing that you have to be aware of is when it comes to licensing, because when people are logging in directly via Entra ID on your site, Microsoft knows that those are internal users, and the licensing, you can use the licensing for internal users if you have Power Apps licenses. As soon as you go through a third-party service, like shouldn't say third party, but some sort of external identity provider, such as Entra External ID, Azure AD B2C, Microsoft doesn't really, or the Power Pages application doesn't know those are internal users anymore, so you're going to get charged credit for them. So that may not be a big problem, but something to consider if part of your plan is to buy Power Apps licenses for your internal users in order to use Power Pages. But again, whether you're using B2C or Entra External ID, either of those providers, you can set up Active Directory or Entra ID, as it's now known, as one of the identity providers in there. And I typically, that would be my preference to do it that way. I just find having, to go to the login page and having users pick between going to Entra ID or say B2C, it's just confusing, especially if it's just for admins. Now you're making most of your regular users click a button to get to the login page that's often confusing, versus just having a where they can go directly to their kind of sign-in page. Okay, I think we got it. Okay, another question here. Is there a recommended approach for B2B when a portal is designed to service multiple customers, all in Microsoft 365, that will allow them to use their login with their existing organizational account rather than create a new one? Yes. So when you are setting up an integration with Entra ID, one of the options when you're setting up your kind of app registrations that you need to hook that up, one of the options is you can check a box that says just my organization or all organizations. So Power Pages does support having Entra ID B2B, like basically guest user accounts. So that would work. So and that allows them to use their organizational accounts with their usernames and passwords to access your system. So it's about setting that app registration. I know that historically we've actually even modified the out of the box app registration that comes with Power Pages, so that the kind of out of the box Entra ID link that you get these days supports organization or accounts from other tenants. I don't know if that's officially supported or not, to be honest. I think Microsoft prefers that you don't touch that thing, but I believe I was instructed by someone at Microsoft that I could give that a try. But if you kind of want to make sure you're totally on the up and up, you can set up a new OpenID Connect provider with Entra ID and just make sure you're checking that, allow all organizations instead of just the single organization. So that's what I would do for B2B on a portal. Honestly, the big problem with that is just that then what do you do for the people who don't have, you could say, if you can guarantee everyone does have a Entra ID account, great. But often it's like, yeah, most people do, but it's like, okay, most is nice, but what about the people who don't? That's where we see, hey, we're going to set up Entra External ID. So we have the local option within Entra External ID, so they can create their own username and password within Entra External ID, and also have Entra ID as an option. Okay, let's see here. So someone mentioned, so they had an issue with login.gov where Power Pages did not automatically sign out, and we had to write a custom sign out feature for that. Okay, I'm going to leave that one just because I do have, I'm going to talk about the external logout. So I will, for now, I'll just keep moving here on my presentation. So those are my recommendations. So what I've got left is a couple of ways, or a couple of kind of practical examples of if you're running into issues with authentication. And there are a few settings that you got to get kind of exactly right. If they're not exactly right, your authentication isn't going to work. But one of the challenges I see is that if you do get one of those settings wrong, one of the problems is that often there's no kind of error message that tells you what's wrong. It just says sign in failed. And it's like, well, great, I know that sign in failed, but why did it fail? Can you give me an error message? And there's nothing there. So what I wanted to do was show how I often will kind of see if I can track down the error message. And the key thing to know here is that when you do authentication, and I'm specifically talking here about OpenID Connect, when you do authentication with OpenID Connect, what's actually happening is there's a bunch of redirects happening. So you're on Power Pages, you're redirected over to your authentication provider. You sign in there, it redirects you back to Power Pages, but not to your sign-in page. It actually redirects you to a handler page. And then if the handler is successful, then it redirects you to wherever you're supposed to go. And so the problem is that the error message, if there is an error, the error message actually is, you can see the error message on the request that goes from the auth provider to the handler, but then by the time you get to the error message page, it's gone. So I'm going to show you how we can track down that error message on that is sent to the handler page that isn't normally visible to users. So I'm going to load this. So I've got a site here. So the key here is to use your browser developer tools. If you open up the network tab, I'm just going to refresh this because I'm sure my portal has gone to sleep, and oh, it's actually alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm opening up my browser tools. I'm hitting F12, opening this up. I'm going to the network tab, and the key here is I'm going to click this preserve log. So I'm going to preserve log. I'm going to clear this out just to keep things fresh. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to click sign in. You'll see I'll clear the thing. So in this case, I've got Microsoft Entra External ID configured. I'm going to click this link. And so now you can see I've been redirected over to my identity provider. So if we're looking at in here, there's a request over to my external identity provider. I'm just going to clear this again to keep it a little bit fresh so we don't have to go through too many logs. So now I'm going to go through the process of actually signing in. And I'm going to clear this. So this next thing, when I click sign in, what's going to happen is this page is going to redirect me over to that handler page. And that is what you'll see as the redirect URL when you're setting up your external identity provider. So you got that redirect URL, and that's where it's actually going to ship me off over to. So you can see it says sign in failed. It's like, great, but like, why did it fail? Can you tell me why it failed? There's nothing on this page. If I look at this page itself, there's no indication in here. There's nothing in the error messages, but there is actually an error message on the step before it. So as I mentioned, when I click the login link, the next thing that happens is I'm sent over to my redirect URL, and what this is it's a page that the user never actually sees because they're redirected away from it so quickly. But it's a page that handles the authentication token that Azure, or in this case, Entra External ID, is handling. So if I click on this, we can see that we actually have some details as to what's going on in here. Because what's happened is the request over from my identity provider is saying, hey, it failed. So it's sending that over to the handler. The handler receives that message, deals with it, and then sends you to the failed page, but the failed page doesn't include these particular details. So by using my browser's developer tools, and the key here is to click this preserve log. If you don't click this preserve log, every time that you kind of get a refresh or a redirect, it's going to go, all these requests are going to go away. So if you click that preserve log, you end up seeing this request. So you're looking for the request that has the redirect URL set up. So if I go to my identity provider setup, you'll see here that we've got the redirect URL. So this redirect URI. So you're looking for that particular URL. So in my case, it's this OpenID_1. So that's it right here. And I can actually see what my error message is. Error description, response type, ID token, not enabled for application. Oh, okay, great. Now actually, sorry, I'm gonna have to reload this because that's expired too. Let's go to portal.azure.com. So I'm going to fix that, but at least now I know how to discover what that error message is. Because otherwise, this is a simple thing to fix. But who knows? There's a lot of simple things that can go wrong that are easy fixes. But if you don't know which of those many things is wrong, it can be very difficult to debug. So I'm going to make sure I'm in the right tenant. So I'm going to go into Entra ID. I'm going to go into my app registrations. I'm going to find the app registration for this particular integration. I'm going to go into here, and it's this thing right here. I just got to check that box. And of course, I unchecked it intentionally before, so I get this error message to show you how that works. But there's lots of various different types of error messages you can get. Sometimes it's the redirect URL is incorrect, but by just going to your browser development tools, enabling the preserve log, you can get a lot more details as to what's going on. So that's how you can debug a lot of auth issues. If you're kind of linking over, you get to your identity provider, you put in your credentials, you put them in, but it's failing on the other side. That's a great way to check out what the errors are that are going on. The last thing I wanted to mention here is viewing the token. So you can pass. So the way this works is that request that goes over to that handler that I was just talking about, if it was successful, would include this token that contains information about the user that then Power Pages trusts and use to create their authentication session. So you can use there's information in that token, and you can actually enable, and they're called claims. So you can include information from your identity provider. So maybe your identity provider has their first name, their last name. You can pass that information via the token as claims. So then what you can do is you can set up, they're called claims mappings, to say, okay, I want every time they log in or when they register, I want you to take the first name from their claims, and their first name is in this field, maybe it's called the given name, and I want you to map that to the first name field in the contact. So you can set up these claims mappings so that when people are logging in or registering, it's updating data in Dataverse based on the token that comes over from Power Pages. Comes over to Power Pages from your identity provider. Um, this is something we do relatively commonly, but it can be a little difficult to set up because the way that the claims come over, sometimes there's kind of weird prefixes. So it's really nice to be able to see, okay, what's the actual token that the identity provider is sending to us. So here I want to show you how you can actually get the token coming from the identity provider. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to enable this because otherwise, if I don't, I'm not going to be able to sign in. But I'm going to just basically follow a similar process. Again, I'm going to leave my browser developer tools on. I'll just clear that for now. But I'm just going to try signing in again. Do this. Sign into this account. All right, so that time it worked. So again, I'm going to go back to that same URL, that sign in OpenID, that redirect URL. And so rather than having the details of the error message, we've actually got a bunch of things. We got a code, we got an ID token, state, session state. What we're interested in is this ID token. I'm going to right click, I'm going to say copy value. And then I'm going to go, so this is actually just a token, the token. Now it's not encrypted, it's just encoded. So if you go to a website called jwt.io, if you've copied that value, you can bring it here. I'm going to paste it in here, and you can actually see the decoded version of your token. So here are all the different details. And what I've done is in my setup, if I go over to here, this is my external ID, external enter ID. I can go into token configuration, and you can see that I've chosen to include the family name and the given name as claims. And we can validate that because within my token, I've got family name and I've got given name. If I remove that, from here, if I remove these, that wouldn't be included in my token. So these are the various things that you can map over. So if I go back to my identity provider in these additional settings, that's where I can set up my registration claims mappings. And you can see what I've done here is I've mapped the family name to the last name, and I've mapped the given name to the first name. And again, the reason this is helpful is that even though it depends on your identity provider, but even though it may say family name here, sometimes the claim can be, you know, some sort of weird prefix, external underscore family name, or custom, or it just depends on the identity provider. So I find it's useful to be able to actually see the token that's been getting passed across to make sure that what you're expecting to set up is there. Sometimes you think you've added it, like as an example, I could go back over here and I can say add an optional claim, but if I add it to the access token instead of the ID token, it wouldn't show up in the place where I need it. So by being able to actually see that token and see the actual claims that are in there can help you verify that yes, if your claims mapping isn't working, is the problem on the Power Pages side, or is it the fact that the token just doesn't have that data to begin with? Okay, let me get back to the questions here. Well, actually, maybe what I'll do is jump back here. And I think so. This was the last topic I'll just cover quickly. So I just want to make sure that people were aware that your login session, you have a different login session with your identity provider than with your Power Pages login. So when you go to initiate this login process, let's say you start off with not being logged in to you're not logged into your identity provider and you're not logged into Power Pages. When you click the sign in page from Power Pages, you're redirected to your identity provider. You then log in and create an authenticated session with your identity provider. And that generally will create some cookies or some way of keeping track of the fact that you're logged into your identity provider. Then you're going to be taken over, redirected to Power Pages, which will then sign you in. But if you were to say use your browser to clear the cookies of your Power Pages site, and then if you were to hit refresh, you would no longer be logged into Power Pages, but you'd still be logged into your identity provider. So when you click on the link to sign in again, you're just gonna see kind of a quick flicker. It's gonna take you over to your identity provider, but you're still logged in there. So they're not gonna ask you for your username and password again. You're going to immediately be signed in to Power Pages. So often we see people kind of, I have to go through the process twice for it to work. Well, that means that whatever's happening the first time isn't coming through properly. But then if I click sign in again, it just works. Well, that's because you've signed in appropriately with your identity provider, but for whatever reason, that first login didn't work and didn't translate back to Power Pages. So generally it makes sense to have similar kind of session timeouts. So if you're going to say, hey, I can be logged into Power Pages for 2 hours, do that for your both your IDP and your Power Pages site, because you should have control over both of those. So keeping those in sync generally makes sense. And then someone was asking about the external logout. So generally with these providers, there is an option to enable external logout. What that means is that if you've enabled it, when you click sign out from Power Pages, it should redirect you to your identity provider, forcing a logout over there as well, and then back to Power Pages. If you don't have that enabled, when you click sign out of Power Pages, it simply clears your session from Power Pages, but you'll continue to be signed in with your IDP. So with that in mind, I think we've got a few questions. So I'm just going to again mention our call. Our next call is going to be April 24th. At the same time, like I said, we got two guest presenters. So the first one is going to be a gentleman by the name of Alexander. He's going to be presenting a Power Pages admin app that he's built with Power Apps. So I think he's got about a 10-minute demo of us of basically a custom solution that he's built to help manage some aspects of Power Pages through a custom admin app. So I thought that'd be interesting for the community to see. And then our other presenter is going to be Nikita Polikov from Microsoft. He's part of the Power Pages CAT team, so the customer advisory team. He works with customers all over the world, helping them with their, if they have any sort of issues or questions. He's a member. He's one of the leading experts on Power Pages at Microsoft, and he's going to be talking to us about user security, data security, that sort of stuff. So that's what we've got coming up next month. Again, thanks to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World. Jason, maybe I'll just kind of quickly get through these questions to see if we've got any left that I haven't talked about here. So Silvio, you talked about the automatic sign out. So the only thing I can suggest is if you've enabled the external logout, generally like that's part of the protocol. So if it's OpenID Connect, or I'm not as familiar with the SAML how that works, but like with OpenID Connect, like there's a particular URL that you put in there, and it should kick you over to that page when you sign out. It'll clear the cookies on there and not. So just making sure but there is an option for that. So if you haven't enabled the external logout, that's not kind of by default. You enable the option to enable external logout. It's not something that's always included. It just kind of depends on your setup. Question is, we've got another question. What's the user experience if the user is authenticated by the identity provider because they have a valid account there, but they're not registered with portals and public registrations are disabled? So, okay, excellent question. So I'll repeat that question. So Adrian's asking, if someone has a valid account with their identity provider, but they aren't associated with a contact in Power Pages, what happens when they go to sign in? Because they arrive at Power Pages, they're not authenticated. They click the link to sign in. When they're taken to their identity provider, for the most part, the identity provider doesn't care whether they have an account with Power Pages. They just all they care about is, do they have a login credentials with the identity provider. So as long as they've got valid credentials over there, they're going to be able to log in. Then it's going to redirect back to Power Pages. This is where the registration process comes in. So Adrian has said public registrations are disabled. So in Power Pages, that's called open registration. So if you have open registration enabled, what's going to happen in that case is that a contact is going to be created. Basically a blank contact that's really the only thing associated with it will be that login information. If you have open registration turned off, you'll get an error message basically saying, yes, you've authenticated, but we're not allowed you into the portal. So if you have open registration disabled, the way to get people into your site is via invitation codes. So basically the short answer to your question, Adrian, is that there's an error message that will be displayed saying that you're not a valid user even though you've logged in successfully. John mentions that auth settings are, so auth settings are all stored as site settings. So a solution might be obvious if you look there to make sure that things are, yeah. So we didn't really talk about like where those are actually configured. I'll maybe just kind of bring that up quickly here. So if we look at when I was configuring these, and where they're actually coming from is site settings. So all of those site settings map to, or all of those settings there. So this identity provider section here are really, it's just a nice interface for editing these site settings. So for example, the all my site settings here, that OpenID_1, they're all coming from these settings. And there's more settings that you can enable in here, more than just what appears in that other interface. All right, I think that covers all the questions. We're about here at the top of the hour, so I think, Jason, we can probably wrap it up there.
All right, great job as always, Nick, and thanks to everyone in the audience for your great questions. Really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you next week. Next month. And Nick, I know you need to head out, so why don't we end it there? We will be sharing info on the recording soon as well.